Greenwich, and our partners tonight, United Jewish Federation of Stanford, Fairfield University, Department of Judaic Studies. And just happy to see all of you here for the finale of the Confronting Anti-Semitism program for the winter and spring season. We hope to be back in fall, late fall, winter, with some more programming around this topic, the global topic of confronting anti-Semitism. And I'd just like to turn the program over to Laura Blum, our amazing program director in Greenwich.
Thank you so much, Pam, and welcome everyone. We are grateful, of course, for the generous support of Lois and Bruce Zenkel for this series. Just a housekeeping word, tonight's format is about a 30-40 minute presentation, followed by about a 15-minute Q&A, so you can already be thinking about your questions. And it is my pleasure to introduce Gavriel Rosenfeld. Gavriel Rosenfeld is Professor of History at Fairfield University, where he focuses on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, memory studies, and counterfactual history. The shelf that holds his writings sags a little more with each book, and here are but 5 of the titles: The Fourth Reich, The Specter of Nazism from World War II to the Present, Hi Hitler, How the Nazi Past is Being Normalized in Contemporary Culture, Building After Auschwitz, Jewish Architecture and the Memory of the Holocaust, The World Hitler Never Made, Alternate History and the Memory of Nazism, Munich and Memory, Architecture, Monuments, and the Legacy of the Third Reich. And then there's What's Ifs of Jewish History, From Abraham to Zionism, which Professor Rosenfeld edited, and Beyond Berlin, 12 German Cities Confront the Nazi Past, which he co-edited. As if that's not enough, he also edits the blog The Counterfactual History Review and is an editor at the Journal of Holocaust Research. Not sure where he gets the time, but we're grateful he's sharing some of it with us this evening. Do join me in welcoming Dr. Gavriel Rosenfeld. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Pam, for your kind introductions. Of course, normally we'd want to do this in person, and I think I've gotten Zoom down to a science so that all the images I'll be showing you this evening will come across clearly. I also have a bunch of clips that are on YouTube that hopefully will come across as clearly as possible. But one of these days, hopefully we can get together in person at whatever local venue and be able to have a bit more of an in-person interchange. So let's talk some alternate history. The image that's up here on the screen is pretty self-explanatory. It's our good friend, the Statue of Liberty, all of 40 miles away from here, and it's giving the Sieg Heil salute. The symbolism is fairly obvious here. What's a little bit less obvious, perhaps, is the subtitle of my talk. And I'd just like to say one or two things about the two phrases, what if and what now. Ordinarily, if we were in one of my undergraduate lectures or seminars, I'd call on somebody right now to offer their interpretation of what the differences what the difference between these two phrases might mean, but because we can't really engage in any interactive dialogue just yet, let me just say one or two things about what I'm trying to get at here. What if, of course, is a backward-looking phrase, and it addresses the question of how American history might have been different had the fascist movement, had the Nazi movement, one or the other, been more effective, been more powerful, and somehow taken hold of the country. What now, of course, is a forward-looking assertion. And what I'll try and point out today, this evening in my remarks, is that the ways in which people in the United States in recent years have imagined alternate paths maybe provide us with some blueprints about how we can contend with and perhaps counteract fascist or far right-wing threats in the present and in the future. So what's the background for this evening's talk? It's all fairly obvious. First, Trump announced his candidacy for the United States presidency in June of 2015, and after his electoral college victory in November of 2016, and over the course of the last 4 years of his administration, Americans have vigorously debated whether or not the United States is facing the prospect of a fascist takeover. And this debate really has been raging for the better part of 5 years. It achieved an initial peak during the Charlottesville protests and violence in the summer of 2017. It ebbed somewhat after the Democratic Party took back the House of Representatives in the midterm elections of 2018. It obviously reached a crescendo this past January 6th with the insurrection at the Capitol. And this debate has been incredibly intense. It's brought multiple camps together. It's witnessed literally thousands of op-eds that have been published. And if anybody's interested, I'll give you a quick plug. I'll give myself a quick plug here. At the end of 2019, I published a piece in Central European History that kind of brought together all the positions in this debate. And even though it ended right before the 2020 election cycle kicked in, most of the larger trends that I documented are pretty much still operative. So I'm happy to send anybody a PDF copy of that article if you just want to email me. In any case, let me say a couple of things about this debate. It's basically pitted two camps against one another. Despite all the various journals and pundits who have said this, that, or the other, two positions have kind of concretized. On the one hand, we could say that there is a group that we'll call the alarmists. And they are convinced, and they have been convinced, really for the better part of the last half decade, that Donald Trump is not that different from Adolf Hitler. They have argued, moreover, as you can see here from this Daily News, New York Daily News headline from March of 2016, or the Washington Post editorial cartoonist Tom Towles cartoon from the same year, you will probably not be too surprised to get the larger message that not only is Trump very similar to Hitler, but that Trumpism is akin to fascism, that American democracy may be going down the tubes, just like the Weimar Republic in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s fell victim to Nazism. And by the same token, many of these alarmist critics have argued that the United States, maybe itself, is doomed for some kind of a fascist takeover. Now, again, there have been dozens and dozens of people who have made these kinds of arguments, but they have been refuted time and time again by a second camp of scholars and journalists and so forth. We'll call them the moderates. They have argued that Trump and his MAGA movement, they're not so much a sign of fascism, but they're an extension of, they're maybe a more extreme expression of longstanding conservative trends within American political life. The 19th century know-nothings, nativist movement, and populists, the 1920s, 1930s Ku Klux Klan, the existence and appearance on the political stage after 1945 of right-wing demagogues like George Wallace and Joseph McCarthy and Pat Buchanan. From the moderates' perspective, what we're seeing right now and what we have seen in the last 5 years is basically better understood, not from the perspective of fascism, but from right-wing traditional populism. So let's cut to the chase. Thanks to this larger debate, scholars like myself, especially scholars in German history, but in American history as well, of course, have become increasingly interested on what the real history of fascism was in the United States, starting in the 1930s up to the present day. And I'm actually co-editing with a close colleague of mine, Janet Ward, at the University of Oklahoma, a new volume which should be coming out next year with Cambridge University Press. It's called Fascism in America, Past and Present. And it actually brings a bunch of different scholars together to examine the history of fascism from the 30s and 40s up until the present day. And it's in that volume, which again, hopefully will be out in about 12 months, that I am myself contributing an essay from which tonight's material is basically taken. The article is called Fascism in American Culture, How Alternate a History. And this article's premise is, in fact, very simple. It argues that while the question of fascism in America is largely a political question, it's also a cultural question, which is to say, for as long as there have been fascist trends in the United States, there have been fears of the prospect of fascism coming to power that have been expressed in films and television programs and novels and works of theater and comic books and you name it. And my jumping off point for tonight is that these fears have been particularly notable in the realm of alternate history, which brings us, of course, to the chief question. What on earth is alternate history? Well, there's a lot of material that we could draw upon to answer this question at great length, but I'll give you the simple version. I think we all know what history is. History is of events that took place in the past. We document those events to be sure, but we also want to assign them significance. We want to impart meaning onto those events. And so the baseline for what historians do, of course, is the historical record, things that actually happened. By contrast, alternate history, or what I these days I'm preferring to call counterfactual history, does something very different. It examines events that never happened in order to examine and determine how history might have been different. And the question that you all may be thinking at this point is, why would anybody waste their time doing this? There are all kinds of reasons, but here I'll just perhaps draw on the famous Oxford historian's claim. Hugh Trevor Roper, well known to some of you for his scholarship on the Nazi period. But back in the early 1980s, he said something that basically sums up my own position. He said, history is not merely what happened, it's what happened in the context of what might have happened. And while that may seem like a subtle distinction, it's absolutely critical. So let me give you two examples of what we might mean by understanding history as not just what happened, but what happened in the context of what might have happened. Two simple examples. On the left, you see, of course, a photo of Hiroshima following the August 6, 1945 bombing of the city that contributed to the end of World War II in the Pacific. Was this the right decision of the United States Air Force to drop the bomb on Hiroshima? And then we'll save maybe for another discussion the question of Nagasaki several days later. The only way historians can judge the suitability, the propriety, the morality, or lack thereof, of dropping the bomb on Hiroshima is asking the question, well, what would have happened if we hadn't dropped the bomb? If we had relied on conventional warfare, seaborne invasion of the Japanese mainland, for example, to end the war in that way. You know, we won't answer this question here and now, but needless to say, anything about any conclusions that we want to offer about causality or about morality requires us to imagine something that happened in the context of how it might have been different. So that's one example. What about the example on the right? We all know January 6, 2021, we witnessed the sacking of the US Capitol, a very traumatic event for everybody. What I was struck by in the news coverage of this particular event, and I posted several blog posts on my blog, The Counterfactual History Review, is that it wasn't just reporters reporting what happened at the Capitol, but asking questions like, wow, it could have been worse. What if the mob had gotten a hold of the senators? What if they had gotten a hold of Mike Pence and hung him? What if, you know, things turned out much worse than they actually did? Or by contrast, what if things had turned out better? What if the Capitol security had actually gotten reinforcements? What if the military had been sent in? So, you know, all these what ifs are absolutely critical and central, even though they rely on speculation. Right? They're not scientifically grounded, but this is what people do when they assess events in the past. So I've been talking about this way of studying history for the better part of 25 years. And as Laura, you kindly noted earlier, I've published several books on the subject. The World Hitler Never Made came out almost more than 15 years ago. It basically was an effort to understand all the different novels and films and television programs that have dealt with various aspects of the Nazi experience turning out differently. And then Laura also kindly mentioned my edited volume, What Ifs of Jewish History, that brought together 16 scholars from Jewish history, Jewish literature, Jewish religious studies to ask any number of questions about how Jewish history might have been different from, again, Abraham to Zionism. I've also been working on editing my blog, The Counterfactual History Review. And if I, again, were able to make this more of an interactive presentation, I'd call on someone to ask them why I have a picture of Elizabeth Taylor here portraying Cleopatra. The famous reason, of course, as some of you may know, is that once upon a time, the famous French scholar Blaise Pascal uttered one of his famous aphorisms that has become quite famous you know, in the centuries that have followed. And what he basically said was something that expresses this very fascinating notion that small causes can have massive effects. What he said, of course, once upon a time in 1662 was that Cleopatra's nose, if it had been shorter, the whole face of the world would have been changed. And that, of course, has to do with Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Augustus Caesar, and how the history of the Roman Republic was shaped, maybe perhaps by Cleopatra's nose, which is, of course, a metaphor for her beauty and so forth. We won't belabor this point too much, but you know, the fact of the matter is that scholars, philosophers, thinkers of all kinds have been meditating on what-if questions for millennia. And the last little plug I'll give about my ongoing research is that I'm currently on chapter 10, chapter 11 of what-ifs in intellectual life. It's called The Origins of Counterfactual History, Wondering What If in the Western World from Antiquity to the Present. And what it tries to document is that, frankly, everybody, since Herodotus, since the ancient Egyptians, have in fact spent a lot of time asking what if questions when they write about history. And we shouldn't demean or dismiss this practice out of hand because it's allegedly not scientific. So perhaps enough about that. One reason, though, why I've been so interested in this subject is that really for the last generation, Western culture has become increasingly saturated with alternate history and with counterfactual history. And just to give you a couple of indications of how this has been taking place, you can find major American writers who once upon a time would have scorned the genre of alternate history, which was easily dismissible as, you know, pulp fiction or sci-fi or whatever, but they themselves have embraced it. So Philip Roth in 2004 very famously published The Plot Against America. We'll talk a lot about that later. Michael Chabon published The Yiddish Policeman's Union in 2008, which focuses on the alternate the allo-historical possibility of FDR creating a Jewish state in Alaska, which was actually a real possibility once upon a time. Stephen King, you're all familiar with him. His novel 11/22/63 from 10 years ago imagined JFK surviving his assassination, and the list goes on and on and on. There's a brand new novel actually about called Rodham, about Hillary Clinton not marrying Bill Clinton and how her career would have been different. There are also countless examples of alternate history in the world of film and television. Kevin Wilmot's amazing mock documentary, CSA, The Confederate States of America, of course, explores the time-honored scenario of the South winning the Civil War. The BBC show Noughts and Crosses imagines that 700 years ago, Africans conquered and colonized Europe, and so the power relations between blacks and whites are inverted. For All Mankind, which is on Apple TV, imagines the Soviets and the United States both colonizing the moon and engaging in fisticuffs, and it goes on and on and on. And of course, all of these topics are quite varied, but what I want to suggest to you this evening is that by far and away the most popular theme that streaming series, big budget television programs have explored is the question of Nazism, or the question more broadly of fascism. And what I want to do is, of course, make it fairly clear that we're going to have 4 major series to discuss this evening. You probably saw some clips of these, the following images in the promotional material for my talk this evening. The 4 major series are as follows. There's, of course, The Plot Against America, which ran on HBO just this past year, and portrays the United States allying with Nazi Germany following the election of Charles Lindbergh to the presidency in 1940. FDR, as in real history, does not get reelected. There is, of course, also Amazon Prime's The Man in the High Castle, which ran for a total of 4 seasons. It began under the Obama administration in 2015. It ended in 2019. Its premise is a bit bleaker. Hard to imagine how, but it portrays how ordinary Americans respond to Nazi Germany's wartime defeat and military occupation of the United States between the years 1947 and the early 1960s. And it's a very in-depth exploration of Philip K. Dick's very famous novel from 1962. There is also, of course, Amazon Prime's 1-season show, which just got renewed for a 2nd season, starring Al Pacino. That is, of course, Hunters, which portrays the efforts of American Nazis in the 1970s, all, of course, set in New York City. It's the effort of these Nazi hunters to thwart the effort of Nazis to try and take power in the US, their effort to establish a 4th Reich. There's a lot of blood and guts, and it's sort of Quentin Tarantino-esque in its direction and so forth. We'll talk more about that. And then finally, there is Watchmen, which just won, if I'm not mistaken, nearly a dozen Emmys a couple months ago in the most recent Emmy Awards. This is another HBO show. It portrays white nationalists seeking to overthrow the liberal presidential administration of Robert Redford in a world where the United States won the Vietnam War. So obviously a very counterfactual premise. What are we going to say about all 4 of these shows? Well, they've attracted tens of millions of viewers, and they've sparked abundant discussion, not only in the arts sections of newspapers, but of course in the arts commentary on many online journals, websites. And my job, I suppose, is to explain to you in a good, 20, 30 minutes, what the common themes are of these 4 shows, how they attack this larger question of fascism in America, what lessons, what messages they're imparting. And of course, the larger point exploring is the way in which these 4 shows articulate present-day fears of right-wing extremism in the United States and what it sort of says we should do about it. I'll be showing you some clips as promised as well. So we will get into the 4 shows in short order. But before we can, it's extremely important to point out that these 4 shows do not appear in a vacuum. They haven't come out of nowhere. Because truth be told, the current wave of alternate histories is by no means the first to express American fears of fascism. You can go all the way back to the 1930s and 1940s, at a time when Father Coughlin was broadcasting his diatribes against Jews and others on the radio, when the Silver Shirts were marching, when the German-American Bund were frightening countless millions of Americans with their right-wing antics. And of course, in American culture, there were plenty of people who took up the challenge of trying to combat these right-wing forces. Sinclair Lewis's famous novel, It Can't Happen Here, being a very good example from 1935. Will Eisner, who some of you may know as the famous creator of The Spirit, he created a comic book called Uncle Sam. And these two works, plus many others, were motivated to try and address the prospect of domestic fascism coming into existence in America, not being imported from overseas, from Germany or Italy, but taking root in the US itself. That was the first wave of what we'll call future histories. In the 1970s, there's a second wave. It's defined by novels like Eric Norden's The Ultimate Solution or Robert Ludlum's The Holcroft Covenant. Both of them either portrayed real historical Nazis conquering the US, that was Norden's focus, or neo-Nazis trying to establish a Fourth Reich, that was Ludlum's premise. And of course, in the 1960s and the 1970s, there are different fears of fascism coursing throughout the United States. This was a time in which the anti-Black racism that was coursing through the country, especially in the Deep South during the Civil Rights Movement, was of great concern to people. The war in Vietnam, Nixon's Watergate scandal, all these things alerted and frightened enough people into thinking that maybe a fascist movement could take root in the United States. And that was reflected in these two works and countless others. A third wave of alternate histories emerged after 9/11, after the Al-Qaeda attacks of 9/11, 2001. Philip Roth's novel, which came out in 2004, was one expression of this fear that maybe in the wake of the Patriot Act and the Bush administration's war on terror, that domestic liberal freedoms were being curtailed. Alan Glenn's novel, American Eagle, which portrays Governor Huey Long of Louisiana being elected president in 1936, was another example of that. And against the backdrop of these three prior phases, I think it's safe to say that our current phase, which basically began in 2015, it's the fourth of a wave of different phases that have appeared since the 1930s. And so in some respects, this is nothing new. In other respects, however, it's something entirely new, because there's three reasons why the new phase is distinct, if not in fact unique. The first, of course, is that this new wave of alternate histories has tremendous political resonance. Right? No matter how bad we might think Nixon was, no matter how bad we might think George W. Bush's administration might have been in terms of moving the political right more to the right, there's no question that the authoritarian tendencies of our recently unelected or diselected president represented a different order of magnitude in terms of various trends that we could, of course, go into more detail should we want to. So people paid attention to these four series, much more so than in earlier eras where the fears of fascism were seen as somewhat exaggerated or hyperbolic. Second of all, this new wave is also extremely distinct because of its popular reach. No matter how much we might say that alternate history has been around for 3,000 years, there's no question that for most of that time, it was on the cultural margins. It was sort of like the bastard stepchild of the historical profession. No one wanted to take it seriously. Whereas the prominence of the four new shows that we're talking about makes it clear that alternate history has left the margins for the cultural mainstream. We're well aware that we've been living in a golden age of television, really a second golden age of television, made possible by the emergence of new streaming series platforms, Netflix, Apple TV, Amazon Prime, and so forth. And all these new opportunities for watching streaming television series is something that many companies have poured millions and millions of dollars into. So these four shows have enormous budgets, high production values. They're not, as schlocky as they may have been in the 60s or 70s. And so they have a lot more pop culture cachet. That's one reason we have to take them more seriously as well. And then finally, number three, the messages of these four, in about 30 seconds, they're much bleaker. They're much more pessimistic than the messages of earlier waves of alternate histories. And you'll have to take my word for that because we can't go into it in great detail. But at this point, we can start talking about what it is that these four shows have in common. First of all, it's worth noting that each of these four shows deals with a different aspect of fascism in America. The Plot Against America on the upper left-hand corner examines the initial emergence of fascism and its attempt to gain power in the United States. So we talk here in this show about incipient fascism. The Man in the High Castle, by contrast, is much more interested in exploring fascism's triumph and its consolidation of power and the horrible crimes that take place in the wake of these events. Hunters, by contrast, fast forwards the tape of history to the 1970s and examines the effort of Nazi hunters to actually prevent a resurgence of fascism following its real historical defeat in 1945. And Watchmen, as the fourth example, depicts the effort to contend with fascism in the present day as it's being reincarnated in the form of white nationalism. So they all are similar in their focus, but they deal with different aspects of fascism. And in order to preview the conclusions that we'll be talking about, and I'll be illustrating with a bunch of examples in the rest of my talk this evening, let me just anticipate what the four basic takeaways are. The first is the most obvious, and that is that all four shows make the case that fascism poses a very serious threat to the United States, and we ignore it at our peril. Second of all, they all basically argue that, very pessimistically, Americans are not, born democratic. We have our own tendencies. We have our own inclinations to maybe passively accept fascist rule, or maybe even, worse still, actively collaborate with it. Third, what these four shows argue is that if we want to combat fascism, vulnerable groups, the targets of fascism, Jews, African Americans, gays and lesbians, and other minorities, we need to combine forces. I'll be illustrating that takeaway as well. And then finally, and this is sort of to raise the ethical dilemma, in combating fascism, so say the four shows, anti-fascists must reflect on whether it is ethically permitted to use violence, or whether doing so may itself be fascist, and whether the people who use violence against fascism run the risk of becoming fascists in their own right. All right, so these are our 4 points that we'll be looking at sequentially. So to turn to lesson 1, the idea that fascism poses a real and serious threat to the United States. I'm going to start showing you guys some clips. These are for the trailers of the shows. Again, I wish I knew how many of you have sat through all the episodes and how many of you are newbies coming to these shows, from basically a blank slate. But the Plot Against America, for those of you, again, who aren't familiar with it, basically, the Plot Against America shows how American society has changed after Lindbergh gets elected president in 1940. Together with his vice president, Burton Wheeler, they basically become German puppets. That gets unearthed over the course of the series. And before long, America has a very, there's a very chilling effect that's brought upon American society, where the government starts moving in a right-wing direction, cracking down on dissent, moving against minorities. And to give you a sense as to how this will all unfold, in video form, let's look at the trailer from the series.
Our candidate for President Charles Lindbergh.
My intention is to preserve American democracy by preventing America from taking part in another world war.
What if Lindbergh does win?
Everyone sees what he is.
He's a hero. To most people, there's never been a bigger hero in their lifetime.
Jewish people and Roosevelt are pushing the United States into this new war.
He's calling us war agitators. Listen to that crowd. This is not an evil man.
Lindbergh is not an anti-Semite. Like hell he's not.
It's a fascist.
The fascists don't like Jews.
Why?
Because we're Jews.
What's our luggage doing here?
There are no vacancies. Take your bags and your family and leave.
Do you have any idea what's at stake in this coming election?
I believe he is a good man. There are so many, though, who don't trust him.
I pledge allegiance to the flag
What is happening in the world today
of the United States of America
is not America's fault.
and to the republic for which it stands, liberty and justice for all.
I want you to be frightened, like your parents.
There's a lot of hate out there. He knows how to tap into it. We have to get out.
They closed the borders.
This is my country.
Not anymore. It is the Jew haters. It is the America firsters. It's their country.
The 33rd President of the United States, Charles.
What just happened?
All right, so you get a sense as to what the general gist is of the plot against America. It's a 6-episode series. It's just one season. So for those of you who want to start off slow, perhaps with all these series, it's a good place to begin. It's not easy watching, but it's incredibly powerful. The second show, by contrast, is The Man in the High Castle. And to illustrate the idea that fascism is a serious threat, what the show basically covers over 4 seasons is how the United States is occupied and split into 3 zones by the victorious Nazis in World War II and the victorious Japanese. You can look at the map on the upper left-hand corner, you see how the United States has been subdivided. The Nazis in this series go on to exterminate all of the Jews of the greater Nazi Reich. There are Jews surviving in the Japanese-ruled part of the West, but they have become increasingly attacked as well. The Nazis go on to exterminate many African Americans, many mentally and physically handicapped individuals. And as the series gets more and more dramatic, the Nazis start to set their sights on the West Coast and taking over that whole part of the country from the Japanese. And to show you how this gets explored in the trailer, we can look at it briefly.
You could do anything with your life. What would you like to do?
My father told me what it was like before the war. He said every man was free. I want my country back.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the Axis powers of America. And to the republic for which it stands. One nation, under rule, divided, with liberty and justice for none.
Evil triumphs only when good men do nothing. I'm here because I want to do the right thing.
Take this. What is this? A way out.
All right, so The Man in the High Castle makes its agenda fairly clear. The third show that illustrates the seriousness of fascism in the United States is Hunters. I don't have a clip that I want to show you from that show now. I want to show you one later, but it focuses on people like Biff Simpson, looking fairly demonic here. He's an ex-Nazi war criminal who has been smuggled into the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, together with hundreds of other Nazis. He is now a Undersecretary of State in the Carter administration. And in this particular still, you see a Holocaust survivor, a female Holocaust survivor, recognizing him together with her husband. Let's just say her fate will not turn out very well in this scene of the show. And then finally, to illustrate the theme that fascism is deadly serious, we have Watchmen. And Watchmen, like I said, portrays white supremacists in the present day world attacking the United States government of Robert Redford. Why? Because the United States government has decided to pay reparations for racial injustice to, say, the survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 and so forth. And to illustrate the petrifying threat that they represent, we can look at this one last clip at this.
We are no one. We are everyone. And we are invisible.
We convinced ourselves that they were gone, but they were just hibernating. They came for everybody. Oh, please. Always live. ourselves.
What are you two talking about?
Oh, nothing. Just the end of the world.
All right, so we're going to take a break from the clips for a little while. Now let's do a little bit of analysis. The second lesson that I outlined a little while ago is that Americans passively accept or actively collaborate with fascist rule. One very clear indication of that is that Charles Lindbergh, very early on in his administration, appoints vicious anti-Semites like Henry Ford, who you see here on the left. And at the same time, 2 years into his administration, you have a wave of pogroms, anti-Jewish massacres that are also directed against African Americans, that are led by Klansmen and members of the German-American Bund, and it leads to the destruction of synagogues, Jewish businesses, and the lynching of African Americans. American Jews even fall victim to certain kinds of illusions that we can illustrate with a couple of examples. Many American Jews don't want to see the writing on the wall. Herman Levin, the series protagonist on the left, is one of them. And in a discussion with his cousin Monty, he says, Lindbergh is a fascist putz. This is before the election is actually held in November of 1940. He says, Lindbergh is a fascist putz. Roosevelt's going to mop the floor with him. You'll see. Everyone I talk to knows that. And then in response, his cousin Monty said, well, who do you talk to? We live in Newark, in Jersey, in the Jewish section of town, which basically highlights the fact that many American Jews, as the show makes clear, are insular. They don't realize outside of their own community, outside their own neighborhood, how many right-wingers truly are in America. And in fact, some of the right-wingers are from their own community. The figure of Lionel Bengelsdorf, the rabbi, played by John Turturro here on the right, ends up being one of the main collaborators with Lindbergh's administration, and his motives are suspect throughout the entire show, but it shows that Jews can actually collaborate with fascism just as much as they might, in fact, be victimized by fascism. The Man in the High Castle also illustrates this theme of Americans' propensity for collaboration. John Smith, of course, is the most important figure, probably the best character in the whole show. He is a lowly American soldier who's captured by the Germans at the end of World War II, but he rises through the ranks after being offered a position in the new Nazi government. He ends up becoming an Obergruppenführer. He ends up becoming the Reichsmarshal of the United States. And why? What are his motivations? Early on in the series, he witnesses, and you can see him here on the left, the nuclear destruction of Washington, D.C. And it makes him recognize that there's really no resisting the Nazis. They're too powerful. But over time, he becomes actually an ideological convert to Nazism. And at one juncture, when he's really rising high up in the ranks, he actually tells Heinrich Himmler, who has succeeded Hitler as the Chancellor and Reichsfuhrer of Germany, that America is a rebel nation. And a German commander might promote unrest in the military. Only an American, of course, only him, John Smith, only an American can truly control it. And what John Smith tries to do throughout these 4 seasons of the show is turn America Nazi, implying that, of course, the country has the potential to go that direction. Hunters also deals with the question of collaboration, although here it's less in the form of ordinary Americans than the US government. The US government, of course, very famously brought in rocket scientists and other Nazi intelligence agents to do their Cold War bidding. And an FBI agent, who's a character in the show named Tommy D'Amato, puts it very succinctly when he talks about, with an FBI agent named Millie Morris, what happened in the immediate aftermath of the war. And this is how I put it. As the war ended, Uncle Sam secretly recruited high-ranking Nazis before the Soviets could get their hands on them. Why? To use as spies, scientists, and engineers. They called it Operation Paperclip. We brought in thousands through that program, whitewashed their documents, and guaranteed them a life of star-spangled apple pie Americana. And of course, the premise of this show, which, like I said a little while ago, is going to have a second season, that these Nazis who were brought into the US, they become covert secret cells that are trying to pursue the creation of a Fourth Reich domestically in the US in the 1970s. Then finally, there's Watchmen, and Don Johnson, who you all know from the 1980s Miami Vice? Was that the 90s? I can't even remember. He plays a sheriff. In fact, he plays the police chief of Tulsa, Oklahoma. But spoiler alert, he's actually an activist in the white nationalist movement. And he is busy infiltrating his members into mainstream American political institutions. So fascism, yes, it can be pursued by any number of Americans. We shouldn't expect anything else. We should be skeptical. Lesson 3 that we can focus on a little bit now in terms of the messages of these shows is fairly straightforward. The targets of fascism, whether they're Jews or African Americans or others, the targets of fascism need to unite. We need to form coalitions. We need to join forces, because divided, we fall. So who are the different characters and what groups do they represent in the Man in the High Castle? First and foremost, you have Frank Frink, who's the series protagonist on the right. He's one of the few Jews who has not been exterminated in Nazi and Japanese occupied America. Then there are many African Americans who belong to a movement called the Black Communist Rebellion, the BCR. People like Belle Mallory on the right, she's one of the leaders, and Elijah to her right. There are gay men like Ed McCarthy, who's Frank Frick's best friend. He illustrates the plight of gay men in Nazi-occupied America. And because it's a big tent, there are even white Christians, such as Wyatt Price, who is of Irish heritage and so knows the experience of oppression at the hands of the English. There's Juliana Crane on the right, another one of the main protagonists of the show, who loses her sister to Japanese murder early on in the season, so she's a victim. And all of these groups struggle throughout the 4 seasons to try and join forces. But it ain't easy. It's not easy at all. There's a serious rift between the Black members of the resistance movement and the non-Black members. And that's expressed very clearly in a famous scene where Wyatt, who we just saw here on the left, is having a conversation with Belle Mallory and Elijah. They're trying to join forces. They're trying to pool their weapons. They're trying to overthrow the Japanese on the West Coast. And when Wyatt proposes to the BCR that they should, in fact, link up, Elijah says, we don't do business with white people. And his rationale is fairly predictable. As he points out, white people did not support Black Americans, either during the era of slavery, during the era of Jim Crow, during the early period of the Nazi occupation. And so why should Blacks trust whites? And so what the BCR's position is from the outset is to pursue a program of self-reliance. And they're striving for an autonomous homeland. That is at least their agenda. Before long, however, it all falls to pieces because in a bunch of pivotal scenes that I won't get into, the Nazi government uses the classic divide and conquer strategy of trying to urge the white residents of California to rise up against the Black residents. And before long, we actually see the BCR recognizing that if they're going to succeed and survive, they have to join up with white resistance figures as well. That's not giving away too much, but it's this message of a going alone procedure is not going to work. Coalition building is of the essence. Hunters makes this clear as well. Even though it's a sort of Black humorish, again, Tarantino-like comic book style portrayal of the activities of these Nazi hunters, they're a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial group. You've got Roxy Jones on the left, you've got Murray and Mindy Markowitz, Holocaust survivors. You've got Sister Harriet, who's Catholic. Lonnie Flash is Jewish, and Joe Mizushima was interned in Manzanar during World War II, along with his family. So you've got a bunch of different Americans, all with histories of oppression, and they find their way towards interacting against the Nazi threat of the 1970s. And here again, let me just cite 2 interchanges. At one juncture, Roxy's husband, who's also Black, starts yelling at her. Why? He says, I don't think you should be giving your blood to anybody but your own. Sort of illustrating the Black separatism potential that you also saw in The Man in the High Castle. But in response, she says, I'm bleeding for the worthiest cause in the whole world. She's not going to separate, rather she's going to ally with others. There's another great scene late in the series where the FBI agent Millie Morris is paid a visit by the American Jewish Congresswoman, Elizabeth Handelman, who, after offering Millie a new position in the FBI to work against counterterrorism, against a Black woman and a Jewish broad being the stuff of Nazi nightmares. This kind of coalition building actually continues very dramatically in Watchmen, where there's a very close friendship between the African-American police officer, Angela Abar, who you see there on the left, and her white friend, Wade Tillman. They are, of course, also superheroes. So Angela Abar is Sister Night, Wade Tillman is Looking Glass, and together they represent again, an interracial alliance that ends up fighting against the common threat posed by white nationalism. That is also, by the way, extended by virtue of the alliance between Angela Abar and Lady Trio, who represents the opportunity of other non-whites, in this case Asians, to be part of this larger multi-ethnic coalition. The exception that proves the rule is, of course, the plot against America, where you don't see, and this is probably due to Philip Roth's own desire in his original novel to focus mostly on Jews in Newark in the 30s and 40s, you don't see a lot of coalition building at all. Even though Black Americans are being persecuted under Lindbergh's administration, the Jewish characters don't think to lock arms with African Americans, and the only sort of gesture towards interethnic solidarity is provided by a moment when the immediate neighbors of the Levin family, the Wishnows, they're deported to Kentucky. An Italian family moves in next door, and Mr. Cucuzza says, when realizing that the Jewish family, the Levins, is experiencing anti-Semitic harassment, brings over a pistol one day as a gesture of sort of help and assistance. And Herman Levin says, I don't know how to fire a gun. And in an immortal line, Mr. Cucuzza says, you just pull it of the trig, which is actually a line in the original Roth novel as well. And finally, if we go to the fourth lesson of what kinds of things are being put forth as sort of the message of this larger wave of series, you have the idea, the ethical problem of whether Jews and others, African Americans, whoever is fighting against fascism, if in the process of fighting against the Nazis, it's okay to use violence. And one of the first signs of Jews in the plot against America realizing that maybe they're going to have to use unconventional methods against the Nazis is when Herman Levin's having a conversation with a friend of his, Irv Simkowitz. And Irv tells him the following. He says, my brother was in Berlin back in 1932, and he wrote to us about what Goebbels and Hitler were up to. The government there, they played by the rules. The Nazis, they made a joke of every damn rule. And now here's FDR playing with his one hand tied behind his back like this is some kind of gentleman's sport. Mark my words, if Roosevelt doesn't do something soon, they're going to be hell to pay. And of course, we know because Lindbergh doesn't play by the rules and Roosevelt does, he loses the election. The Man in the High Castle does the same thing. In a very pivotal scene, Juliana Crane here on the right is having a conversation with George Dixon, who's the resistance leader on the left. And George Dixon tells Juliana that the next strategy of the resistance movement is to target the Reichsfuhrer of the United States, John Smith's son, for an attack. And Juliana tells him, you're no better than the Nazis, when she hears of this horrific plan, targeting a Nazi leader's son. To which he replies, if we're going to beat the Nazis, we have to be worse than the Nazis. Hunters is by far and away the most explicit show that explores this ethical dilemma. Al Pacino, who you see here on the left, plays a Jewish Holocaust survivor named Meyer Offerman, who's the leader of the Hunters. And he defends vigilantism to his protege, Jonah Heidelbaum, played by Logan Lerman here on the right. And what he says is that if you're going to fight against the Nazis, you have to use an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of method. And in the clip I'm going to show you right here, you see a very familiar line, very famous line from the show.
There comes a time where we all must choose between the light and the darkness. But when there's great darkness in this world, perhaps the choice is made for us. You know, for eons, people like us have been degraded, exterminated, but no more. There is evil among us, and you must remember, this evil starts as but a spot inside of thing. Then it grows to a stain. Then it becomes a scourge. And we can't know such evil until it strikes. So the time to act is now. Before everything we hold dear to us is this is not murder. This is mitzvah. Welcome to the hall.
All right, right, so this famous line spoken by Meyer Offerman, this is not murder, this is mitzvah. This is a very profound ethical dilemma that the hunters are facing. And while much of the show is devoted to the effort of its young protagonist, Jonah Heidelbaum, to decide whether he's up for killing people and whether he's up for all the sadistic methods that Meyer Offerman comes up with killing Nazis, such as gassing a former concentration camp guard in her shower, what you'll find is that eventually he does decide that murder is the best strategy. As he puts it, the Nazis are everywhere, and because the Nazis are everywhere, we have to do what is wrong. So ethics get thrown out the window. Angela Abar in Watchmen, just to conclude here, also takes the same position as Sister Night. She's routinely beating up and using extra legal methods to combat white nationalism. And in one of the series' most interesting sort of subplots, it turns out, without getting into too much detail, in fact, I won't wreck the spoiler. I won't give you the spoiler. Don Johnson on the left, the Tulsa police chief, has a very complicated relationship with Angela Abar's grandfather, played by Lou Gossett Jr. here. On the right, a famous 1930s superhero named Hooded Justice. I'll let you see the conclusion for yourselves. So what's the conclusion that I want to come to before we have perhaps just a little bit of time for questions? It's certainly not the case that the cinematic exploration of white nationalism and far right-wing extremism has been restricted to alternate history. The three posters that are up here on the screen portray films: Spike Lee's Black Klansman, Jordan Peele's Get Out, and the film Antebellum, which is the only one I haven't yet seen. But they all portray the danger of white nationalism outside of the genre of alternate history. So the question, of course, becomes, what is alternate history? What do counterfactual portrayals of the threat of white nationalism offer to us that conventional works of historical narrative or representation provide? I guess I would argue the following. Conventional works of film or literature, for that matter, they remain restricted by the facticity of the past. That's to say, they remain restricted by what actually happened. They're not going to be showing the course of history being altered. That's what alternate history does. So to some degree, their ability to portray nightmares is limited. Whereas alternate histories, by showing how the course of history can be ruptured, most often in nightmarish fashion, they can actually offer a much more admonitory and chilling message. And I think perhaps that's one reason why this present-day fear of fascism has been explored in alternate history, which can, of course, explore worst-case scenarios, worst-case outcomes. Now, all that being said, I don't want to overestimate the significance of all of these recent explorations of American fascism and alternate history. It's certainly tempting to make the argument that their proliferation reflects the existence, the real existence of fascism within our own society at this point in time. But I would caution any of us to make the case that art is imitating life, and that all we're basically seeing in these shows is a sort of mimetic portrayal of our present-day reality. Because at the end of the day, alternate histories represent fears. They express fears more than anything else. However, what is clear is that the fears of fascism have never been as strong as they are today in America circa 2021. And with that, I think hopefully we've surveyed the scene fairly thoroughly, and I'm happy to take any questions.
And are we hearing some questions? So I think what we can do, it was such a rich and robust presentation, and you live in Greenwich. So I think what we might want to do is to wait until a time where we can bring you in physically and actually have a 3D in the flesh continuation, perhaps more magnified with one or more narrow examination of one of the properties. But you just said something really interesting, which is that we said many things interesting, but I was alarmed that this is always based on fear. And Garrison Keillor had asked why alt histories are always negative, essentially asking the question, what if everything were worse? And I just wanted to quickly ask, are there in fact, what if alt histories where it's rosy? What if?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example. So back in 1993 or 94, if I'm not mistaken, Harry Turtledove and Richard Dreyfuss, the actor, wrote a famous novel called The Two Georges. And the premise of that novel is that the American Revolution never happens. And the British retain control over the United States. And it sounds like a nightmare, but in fact, it's actually a fantasy, because under British rule, slavery gets abolished much earlier in the 1820s or 1830s. There's no civil war. There's great race relations. Martin Luther King is the governor of one of the states in the North American Union, which is a conglomeration of Canada and the US. There is no US, because we're living under British rule. And why did Harry Turtledove and Richard Dreyfuss write this novel? Because in the early 1990s, of course, we had the OJ trial, we had the LA riots. I was living in Los Angeles at the time. There was such pessimism about race relations and the future of American, social cohesiveness that, as we know, when times are tough, oftentimes we fantasize about how things might have been better. So the twin kinds of approaches in alternate history you always see are nightmares and fantasies. And one way of coping with a present day discontent is to imagine things being better, wish fulfillment fantasies, if you will. There's also, of course, the tendency to imagine nightmares when you're upset or anxious about the present, so it can cut both ways. But by and large, you find that over many, many decades, if not centuries, most alternate histories conform to one or the other of those kind of models.
Nightmares and Fantasies sounds like another title of one of your books, of your future books.
It's a good sort of interpretive model to employ.
So thank you so much. It was wonderful to learn with you. And thank you to all for joining us for this series. And we look forward to reconvening in the fall. Thanks you so much. Good night to all.
All right, thanks.